I just a victim to who I am? I'm your host, Steve Sisler. Stay tuned for another episode of Behavioral Insights.
It is not only the old who are wise, not only the aged who know what is right. This is a quote from Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite. It's probably about 3,000 years old. Maturity doesn't come with age, folks. It comes with the acceptance of responsibility. Coming up next, part 3 of our Waking Up series. Stay tuned. Welcome back, folks. We're talking about taking responsibility. We're going to be talking about decisiveness. We're going to be talking about functional authority. There's a couple of things we're going to be talking about today in this particular podcast. So I opened with maturity doesn't come with age. It comes with the acceptance of responsibility. That's a really big thing. We all know a 15-year-old who's as mature as a 50-year-old, and we all know a 50-year-old who acts like a 15-year-old. So I don't think I need to go much into that. But I do want to talk a little bit about decisiveness right now. So the ability to decide is really one of the most fundamental principles of being a good leader, of being a good wife, a good husband, a good mother, a good father, a good anything. It's important that we can make decisions. We make good decisions. So it's really paramount. So we saw this in the Moses story a little bit. We see it in my friend Mike, who we talked a little bit about. And we see it in the Hebrew King David, which we'll talk a little bit about. But many people struggle with this process. You know, the fear of failure or the fear of making a wrong decision keeps a lot of people in what I call the prison of indecision. And so the power of decision making, it's not only beneficial to the person that's having to decide, it's also important to those who are affected by decisions that are made or not made. So indecision is really a form of hiding. Sometimes it's a form of perfectionism, but it can also be a form of hiding. It's the person who hears, a ruckus in the street, and then rather than investigate to make sure everybody's all right, they close the shade. I talked about that last time. I heard a 911 operator speaking to a concerned citizen. I don't know if you remember the George Zimmerman court case years ago. But the caller distinctly heard someone screaming for help outside their apartment, but rather than going outside to intervene, they called 911 and refused to open the door. And when they went back in hindsight and looked at this, and based upon where the person was located, probably would have saved a life if they went outside. But nope, they hid. The victim probably would have lived if they simply opened the door and said, "What's going on out here?" That might have been enough to disrupt what was going on. So what's a good PowerPoint for this? Fear keeps many people in a state of indecision. Oftentimes it's fear. So this person wasn't able to make a quick decision, but then when they tried to finally make a decision, it was the wrong decision. Why? Fear. In this case, it was fear. Because when speaking with the operator, the individual claimed, "I don't know what's going on out there, and I don't want to find out." So this is where a lot of people get hung up. They don't know what's going on, so they don't do anything. Choosing a clear path in unclear moments is really powerful. And there are some people that tend to be up for that, and there's a lot of people that are not up for that. And I would say most people are not up for that. The only approval needed to move forward for the people that do something is basically coming from the need to do it because it's the right thing to do. So this is how we respect the power of choice. So another reason why people don't make good decisions is because many disrespect the need behind it. So in other words, the need to not act becomes more important than the need that requires the action. So this usually occurs when the fear of action and failure is greater than the need to act in any particular circumstance. So it's less about what's going on and more about how it's affecting me. So it's important to understand that. This happens in a story I want to bring up in the from the prophets of the Bible. There's the law, and then there's the prophets. When the armies of Israel were facing the Philistine army, you're going to know what this is in a minute. It's the story of David and Goliath. So King Saul was the king, and the Israelites were camped in this valley called Elah. So it was the valley of Elah. And they'd drawn up a battle line in order to meet their enemy, the Philistines. So it was sort of like a Civil War standoff. And that's how they used to do it. If you've seen Braveheart, okay, you got a line of these guys and a line of those guys, and we're just facing each other, and then we just charge. So it's crazy, but it's what people used to do before guerrilla warfare and conventional warfare. But anyway, there's these battle lines that are drawn up in the valley of Elah in the Old Testament of the Bible. And so there's just this long standoff. So David, the story of David, begins sort of here, where David was actually acting as a water boy for the people on the front line. And he would bring bread and cheese and water to the commander of the unit, as well as his brothers, which were also fighting on the front line. Now, I'm telling you this because there are principles here you need to understand. So I want you to get into this story for a minute to see what's happening. It was David's father, Jesse, that asked him to bring the bread and the cheese to the unit. So he was acting as a gopher, basically, for the people in the military here under his father's bidding. So David followed the orders he was given. Now, the thing about David is he doesn't complain. He doesn't say it's dangerous. He just does what his father asks. So David's character here, you can see that he was faithful with just very practical things. Now, early the next morning, David loads up his animal and sets out as his father had directed him. And then he arrives at the camp just as the men were taking up their battle positions and shouting the war cry against this Goliath from Gath, Gath. So this is when the story gets really interesting. As David runs to greet his brothers and begins a short conversation with them, Goliath, this supersized Philistine champion, and according to scriptural research, Goliath was about 13 feet tall. Now, this is likely a myth, but anyway, just for the sake of the story, I want you to get into the story and imagine this. And so David runs to greet his brothers, and then this giant starts shouting his usual defiant mockery against the Israelites and their ideals, or their God. This reminds me of the opening scene in the movie Troy, where the giant guy comes out from the battle lines and moves out from the line and starts mocking the other king and his army. And then Brad Pitt, is with the girls in the tent, and then he comes running to the battle and then just runs towards this giant and climbs right up his thigh and jams that sword down in the back of his neck. I mean, it's such a great scene. But this is the type of thing that this story represents. And so this is found, by the way, in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17. All this that I'm telling you. And so it's just a great story. Now, when he's mocking Israel and the deity and all the people, it says in 1 Samuel 17:23, as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. Now here it comes. And David heard it, period. I just love this because picture David, he's a kid, right? He's a kid. He's like a teenager. And he's just out there, bringing food to the troops. They're all terrified. And David hears this mockery coming from this Goliath from Gath, and he goes, basically, what did he just say? I don't know why this gets me like it does. It's just a great story. And so, this mockery that this giant was doing just really tripped his switch. And so in that moment, David asks, the commanding officer, what will be done for the man that removes this disgrace from Israel? So I just wish they could make a really good movie around this, that really depicted the way this makes me feel when I read this story. But you see, David's concern here was not for himself. It was for the reputation of his nation, the deity that was represented there in this particular tribe. But he was selfless. So what's a PowerPoint we can learn from this? Well, strong leaders don't put up with this crap. They step in and they make a difference. So while every soldier's running in the other direction, this kid is standing there without any disinclination. It's like he's like ready to take this guy on. And so this brief, insignificant, really, part of the story represents some interesting truths here. Now, while David was discussing what'll be done to the giant, what'll be done for the guy who, basically kills this giant, his older brother, whose name is Eliab, hears him talking. And it says in the Bible here that he burned with anger against his brother David. Now, this is what happens when people by nature just do what is right around people who by nature don't. And so you may have experienced this. So not only is this probably some sibling rivalry here, it's really cowardice and jealousy on the part of his brother. So Eliab, says to David, he calls him conceited, he calls him wicked, and he calls him reckless. So this is really interesting because he does nothing towards the giant for saying these things against his tribe, but he gets all over his younger brother David because he wants to do something about it. And so I find this really interesting. So like Moses, right? David always unearths the two distinct characteristics within two types of people. Again, I'm going to reiterate this. He exposes the jealousy and the ambitious, and he exposes the fear and the insecure. And this is what we see happening here with Eliab, his brother. Acting on what is right will sometimes test and try all your personal relationships. Doing the right thing, especially within your own family. So I've always found this piece of the story puzzling until I really figured out what was going on here behaviorally in this story. And what's crazy about these Hebrew stories is the behavioral, motivational, axiological pieces that you can see throughout these stories, just flat out human nature at its best and its worst. And that's why I like the stories in the Torah. So David reacts immediately by asking his brother Eliab, he says this, now what have I done? Now, this is a clue. It's almost like this is something his brother does all the time. Like, what have I done now? This kind of an attitude. And he's really displaying frustration with his older brother by using the word now. Now what have I done? So that's interesting. So this has likely happened before. So what do we got here? Jealousy. This is just pure jealousy. And so it really allows us to assume here by reading this that this must have been a common occurrence in David's life. And his highest qualities are overshadowing the inabilities of those close to him and around him. The unfaithful always find fault with the faithful. I don't know if you've noticed that. Maybe at work, you're being faithful, and you basically get looked down on for doing what is right, or for clocking out at the right time, or because you don't take advantage. It's almost like you're considered weak if you're not ripping off your employer by some people. It's just interesting. If you've lived a long time, I'm 56, so I've been around a little bit. I've seen all this in work over the years. And so it's interesting to note that human nature has never changed for thousands of years. David's oldest brother knew David was a viable threat. And so this is what's happening here. Insecure people always make a habit of finding fault with those who threaten their ability or take action when they should have taken action, but they didn't. David obviously had more courage and determination than anyone else on that line. And when he was about to show his quality, those that knew him the most, those that knew him best, I should say, were basically pissed because they're like, great, now David's going to show us up again. So this is what I find interesting about David. So David was not attempting to be brave. He wasn't jockeying for points like probably the rest of his family. David's risking his life here for what he believed in. And he was the only one on the front line willing to do it. And he didn't even belong there. He wasn't even qualified. He wasn't a warrior. He was a shepherd. So this was an easy decision for David to make. Something was wrong and he needed to make it right. Now, speaking of qualifications, where do you think qualifications come from? Now, this is really, really important. Most of today's qualifications are measured in title, not in deed, all right? Measured in title, not in deed. In other words, having a title today tends to supersede ability. But this is what I want you to understand about this story. So David's brothers had all the titles, but David had the ability. Oh my God, you gotta get this. David's brothers had the titles, but David had the ability. So here's a story I tell a lot when I'm consulting. I use this as an illustration. So think about this story here. I'm just making this story up. Just say you're in a car accident and you're lying on the road and you're unable to feel your legs. All right? That's a problem. All right, I'm going to sneeze here, I think. All right, hold on a minute. All right, I think I'm good. So you're in an accident, you're lying on the road, you're unable to feel your legs. So let's say a police officer comes by and masks off the road with his yellow tape and tells everyone to step back. So he addresses the situation with title, authority, a gun, a badge, a uniform. So he has signs of authority. This is known as an appeal to authority. So outward signs that prove that he's in a position to make these types of decisions. When we see the badge, the gun, and the uniform, we all know what that means, and people tend to step back when they say so. Because you can't feel your legs, you know you've got some spine issues. And let's say there's leaking gasoline, there's smoke, there's a small flame in the engine, and it's really a matter of time before this really catches on fire. So now what? Let's say he wants to move your broken body off the road. So the policeman says, I need to move you, this is dangerous. And right at that moment, there's this new development. A cyclist comes by wearing a sweatsuit, and he looks like to be about 35 years of age. He's pretty sweaty. He's been riding his bike all morning. And he says this to the police officer. Hey, I'm John. I'm a spinal surgeon. Do you need any help? Now, who do you think has the authority to move the body? The policeman or the spinal surgeon? All right. Well, if you're thinking right, it would be the spinal surgeon. Why? Because the spinal surgeon knows spines. The policeman doesn't. And so when it comes to moving your body, he has more functional authority. So what is functional authority? It's the authority of function. In other words, you're in charge if you know what to do through either training, gifting, education, talent, whatever the case may be. If you know what to do, you are in charge. So David was the spinal surgeon, his brothers were the cops, and Goliath was the broken body lying in the street that needed to be moved. David had the functional authority while everybody else only had title authority on the front lines that day. This is key to this story. And so, as I said earlier, courage is not the absence of fear, it's the absence of self. It's not that David wasn't afraid. I'm sure he was afraid in this story. But this absence of self was something David's brothers apparently knew nothing about. And then they got upset when David displayed it. So David was all about being true to who he was and what he believed in, and through the process of working out what was on the inside, he ends up on the world stage. So this story right here thrusts David into the Old Testament here as a huge figure throughout several more books of the prophets. And so it's very, 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 very powerful. Now, I think I'm going to end it right here because there's so much more to talk about in this particular story of David, which I'll address on the next one. But what can we go over here? What can we come away with? David had functional authority. He had no title authority. David had no flattering titles. He was just a shepherd kid minding his own business, being faithful in all these practical things like bringing food to the troops. And then when he sees something that's wrong that needs to be made right, he steps up while everybody else watches. And his brothers get mad at him because he's making them look like they don't care or they're afraid or stupid or something. And excuse me, they get upset. And so I want to now talk a little bit about you. Where are you in all this? Not in this particular story, but in your own story, because everybody's living a story. Are you living a story that I'd want to read? Or is it boring? Like, what do you do when the chips are down? Like when you're at work and you have title authority, Do you operate also to the degree that you have title authority and functional authority? Or do you not know what you're doing? Or are you afraid to make the right decision because of what somebody might think? These types of things. This is what courage is really all about, folks. It's about doing what is right no matter what. And being able to do that really displays your sense of true leadership, if you've got any. And so that's the really the point I wanted to hammer home for you today on this particular story. So I hope you liked it, and we'll continue this in the next episode. And you've been listening to Behavioral Insights, and I'm your host, Steve Sisler. Until next time, I can't wait to share the rest of this story.